A lone rancher proposed marriage to pay his debt, but her surprising answer changed his life forever. The wind howled down from the sawtooth peaks, a living thing with teeth of ice that gnawed at the chinking of the cabin walls. Thorne sat at his rough-hewn table, the wood scarred by years of solitary meals and the careless drag of heavy spurs. A single kerosene lantern cast long, dancing shadows against the timber, illuminating the grim set of his jaw as he stared at the document before him. The paper was crisp, an intruder in a room filled with worn leather and rusted iron, bearing the seal of the Territory Bank. It was an eviction notice disguised as a final courtesy, a demand for payment that Thorne did not have. The harsh winter of the previous year had taken half his herd, freezing the cattle where they stood in the drifts, and the subsequent drought had withered the grass until the earth cracked open like a thirsty mouth. He had the land, he had the strength of his back, and he had a stubborn refusal to bend. But none of those things counted as currency in the ledger of the banker Halloway. Thorne rose, his movements stiff from a day spent mending fences in sub-zero temperatures. He was a man carved from the landscape itself, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of slate and hands that were permanently stained with soil and oil. He walked to the window, scraping a circle in the frost to peer out at the white desolation. The snow was piling high against the barn, a relentless tide threatening to swallow his life's work. Halloway had offered a reprieve, a loophole in the original homestead charter that Thorne's father had signed decades ago. A married man with a registered household could claim an extension on the loan repayment, categorized under family hardship rather than business failure. It was a bureaucratic technicality, a slip of paper that could buy him 6 months, enough time to drive the remaining herd to the railhead in the spring. But Thorne was alone. He had been alone since the fever took his parents, and the solitude had become a second skin, comfortable and protective. The idea of marriage was foreign, a softness he could not afford. Yet the alternative was losing the only patch of earth that knew his name. He turned from the window, the decision settling in his gut like a cold stone. He would not lose the ranch. If the bank required a wife to balance the books, he would find one, not for love, but for survival. The ride into town the next morning was a battle against the elements. Thorne's horse, a massive roan named Rusty, snorted clouds of steam into the frigid air, plodding through drifts that reached the animal's knees. The sky was a flat, oppressive gray, promising more snow before nightfall. Thorne kept his chin tucked into his sheepskin collar, his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the horizon for the familiar shapes of the settlement. When the town finally emerged from the white haze, it looked fragile and temporary, a collection of wooden boxes huddled together against the vastness of the plains. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight, desperate columns. He stabled Rusty, paying the boy extra to rub the horse down with dry straw, and made his way to the lawyer's office, first to confirm the clause, then to the general store to purchase supplies he could barely afford. The town was quiet, the cold driving everyone indoors, leaving the muddy thoroughfare empty save for a few stray dogs shivering under the boardwalks. It was near the laundry house behind the hotel that he saw her. The contrast was so sharp it almost hurt his eyes. Amidst the gray slush, the dirty canvas tents, and the dull brown of the buildings, she stood like a drop of blood on fresh snow. She was wearing a cheongsam of deep crimson silk, embroidered with gold thread that caught the meager light. It was a garment of beauty and tradition, utterly impractical for the frontier winter, yet she wore it with a regal defiance. She was kneeling by a steaming tub of water, scrubbing heavy woolen trousers that belonged to the miners. Her hands, red and raw from the scalding water and biting air, moved with a rhythmic, punishing efficiency. Thorne stopped. He knew of the immigrants who had come for the railroad and stayed to scrape a living in the laundry houses and kitchens, often trapped by debts to the companies that brought them over. He watched her for a long moment. She was young, perhaps 25, with hair black as a raven's wing pulled back tight, revealing a face that was striking not just for its beauty, but for the hardness in her eyes. She stopped scrubbing and looked up, sensing his gaze. She did not flinch or look away. She stared right back at him, her expression unreadable, her posture straight despite the cold that must have been cutting through the silk. Thorne approached, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen mud. He was not a man of many words, and he had no practice in the delicate art of courtship. This was business. He needed a partner on paper to save his land. She looked like someone who knew the weight of a burden. He stopped a few feet from her, the steam from the laundry tub rising between them like a veil. "I have a proposition," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. The woman wiped her hands on a rag, the movement slow and deliberate. She stood, and though she was nearly a foot shorter than him, she did not seem small. "I am listening," she said. Her voice was clear, accented but precise, carrying a steeliness that matched his own. Thorne outlined the situation without embellishment. He spoke of the debt, the ranch, the bank's clause, and the need for a marriage certificate. He offered her a roof, food, and the protection of his name. He did not offer love, and he did not ask for it. He offered an escape from the freezing laundry tub and the debt he assumed she carried. When he finished, he waited, expecting a quick agreement born of desperation, or perhaps a negotiation for money. She studied him, her dark eyes sweeping over his worn coat, the gun at his hip, the callousness of his hands. She saw a man who was cornered, just as she was. She took a step closer, the red silk rustling softly. "You need a wife to keep your land," she stated, not as a question but as a verification of facts. "And you think I need a rescuer." Thorne shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I think winter is hard," he replied simply, "and I think you are cold." May, she told him her name then, lifted her chin. This was the moment that would define their future, though Thorne did not know it yet. He expected her to ask about the size of the house or the warmth of the fire. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye. "I do not want to be rescued, Mr. Thorne. I want to be an owner." The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't blink. "I will marry you. I will sign your paper. But I will not be a servant in your house. If I work the land, if I suffer the winter, half of what we save is mine. Not a gift. Mine by right." Thorne stared at her. Most women in the territory would have asked for a ticket east or a monthly allowance. May was asking for equity. She was asking for a stake in the very soil he was trying to save. It was a surprising answer, one that shifted the ground beneath him. He looked at her hands again, red, swollen, but strong. She wasn't looking for a soft place to land. She was looking for a place to stand. A grudging respect sparked in his chest, warm and unfamiliar. He needed a wife for the bank, but a partner for the ranch would be worth far more. He extended his hand, a massive, rough paw against the delicate backdrop of her silk dress. "Agreed," he said. "Half the increase, once the debt is paid." May looked at his hand, then reached out and gripped it. Her palm was rougher than he expected, her grip firm. "Then we have an accord," she said. The deal was struck not with a kiss, but with a handshake in the freezing mud, binding two solitary souls together against the world. The ceremony was a stark affair, conducted by the town's justice of the peace in a dusty office that smelled of stale tobacco and ink. The official mumbled through the words, his eyes darting between the towering rancher and the woman in the red Cheongsam, clearly perplexed by the pairing. Thorne signed his name with heavy, deliberate strokes. May signed hers with elegant, vertical characters next to the English translation. There were no rings, only the exchange of papers and the grim satisfaction of a legal hurdle cleared. They walked out into the biting wind as man and wife, strangers bound by ink and necessity. Thorne helped her into the wagon he had loaded with supplies. She climbed up without waiting for his hand, gathering the skirts of her dress around her. He noticed she had no heavy coat, only a thin shawl. Without a word, he unbuttoned his sheepskin jacket, took it off, and draped it over her shoulders. It engulfed her, smelling of pine and horse, but she pulled it tight. She nodded once, a silent acceptance of the practicality. Thorne climbed onto the bench seat, took up the reins, and whistled to the team. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the town behind as they headed into the deepening gray of the afternoon. The journey back to the ranch was a trial of endurance. The snow began to fall in earnest, thick, heavy flakes that blotted out the horizon and turned the world into a swirling white void. The temperature plummeted. Thorne kept the horses moving, his eyes narrowed against the sting of the ice. He glanced sideways at May. She sat upright, wrapped in his oversized coat, her gaze fixed on the ears of the horses. She did not complain. She did not ask how much farther. She simply endured. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the creak of the wagon wheels, the heavy breathing of the horses, and the unspoken question of what awaited them at the end of the trail. The road became treacherous, the wheels slipping in hidden ruts. At one point, the wagon slid dangerously toward a ditch. Thorne fought the reins, his muscles straining, cursing under his breath. Before he could shout an order, May was already moving. She scrambled down from the seat, sinking into the snow, and grabbed the bridle of the lead horse, soothing the panicked animal and pulling with a strength that belied her frame. Together, they guided the team back onto the hardpack. When she climbed back up, breathless and shivering, Thorne looked at her. "Good work," he said. It was the most he had spoken in hours. "Drive," she replied, her teeth chattering, but her eyes burning with that same fierce resolve. They reached the cabin well after dark. It was little more than a shadow against the snow, a squat structure of timber and stone. Thorne halted the wagon and helped May down. Her legs were stiff from the cold, and she stumbled slightly, but she righted herself before he could catch her. He led her to the door, kicking the snow away from the threshold, and pushed it open. The inside was freezing, the fire having died out hours ago. The air smelled of cold ash and solitude. Thorne struck a match, lighting the lantern, and the room flickered into view. A single room with a loft, a rusted iron stove, a table, and a narrow bed in the corner. It was a man's den, functional and bare. He watched her as she looked around. He felt a sudden sharp pang of shame for the roughness of it, for bringing a woman in silk to a place so devoid of comfort. But May did not recoil. She walked to the stove, ran a finger along the cold iron, and then turned to him. The red of her dress was the only color in the room, a heartbeat in the gloom. "Wood," she said, pointing to the empty box, "and water." Thorne nodded, retreating out into the cold to do the chores he had done 1,000 times. But this time the labor felt different. He wasn't just keeping himself alive anymore. He was building a fire for a partner who had already proven she wouldn't let the fire go out. The weeks that followed were a lesson in the architecture of silence, a restructuring of the void that had occupied Thorne's cabin for so long. Life on the ranch was a series of relentless demands, a cycle of feeding, breaking ice, and mending what the wind had torn down. But now there was a second rhythm overlaid upon his own. May did not shrink into the background as he had half expected. Instead, she occupied the space with a quiet, pervasive intensity. She had taken his spare flannel shirts and heavy wool trousers, cutting and restitching them with the sewing kit she had brought in her small bundle, transforming his cast-offs into functional workwear that fit her slender frame, though she always wore the high collar of her cheongsam underneath, a flash of crimson silk visible at her throat like a secret defiance. She took over the cooking, and though the pantry contained only beans, salted pork, and flour, the meals changed. They became richer, seasoned with dried herbs she found in the root cellar, and a patience Thorn had never possessed. The cabin began to smell less of stale grease and more of something warm and complex. In return, Thorn began to notice the drafts. He spent his evenings not just staring at the fire, but whittling pegs to plug the gaps in the window frames where the cold air hissed in near where she sat mending. He didn't announce these repairs. He simply did them. One evening, after he had spent an hour securing a loose floorboard that had always creaked under her step, May looked up from her work. The lantern light caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone and the softness of her mouth. "The floor is silent," she observed, her voice low. Thorn grunted, tossing a wood shaving into the stove. "Loose board," he said. "Dangerous." It was a lie. The board had been loose for 10 years. May looked at him, a flicker of something soft passing behind her dark eyes. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. It was an acknowledgment of the act, a recognition that his labor was his language. Then came the night the temperature dropped until the very air seemed to shatter, and the wolves came down from the high timber. It started with a low, mournful howling that prickled the hair on Thorn's arms, followed by the terrified bawling of the calves in the lower pen. Thorn was out of bed and into his boots before the echo died, grabbing his rifle from the wall. He expected May to stay huddled under the quilts, but as he reached for the door, he felt a hand on his arm. She was there, dressed in the heavy coat he had given her, a lantern in one hand and a pitchfork in the other. "Stay," he commanded, his voice rough with sleep and adrenaline. "No," she replied, the word hard as flint. "My investment is in that pen." There was no time to argue. They burst out into the swirling white darkness, the wind hitting them like a physical blow. The pen was a scene of chaos, shadow shapes moving through the snow, the heavy bodies of the cattle pressing against the rails. Thorn fired a shot into the air, the crack of the rifle swallowed instantly by the gale, but it scattered the pack for a heartbeat. A large gray wolf, emboldened by hunger, lunged for a straggler calf near the gate. Thorn cycled the bolt, but May was closer. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She drove the tines of the pitchfork into the snow between the wolf and the calf, shouting a guttural, fierce cry that sounded ancient and terrifying. The wolf snarled, snapping at the wood of the handle, but May stood her ground, a small figure against the beast, the red collar of her dress visible even in the storm. Thorn took the shot then, dropping the animal, and the rest of the pack melted back into the tree line. When the silence returned, filled only by the wind and the heavy breathing of the cattle, Thorn looked at her. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the cold and the adrenaline dump. He walked over, checking the calf, then looked at her. He didn't tell her she was foolish. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing the snow from her shoulder. "You have good aim," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. They retreated to the cabin, the adrenaline fading into a bone-deep exhaustion. The fire had burned low and the room was chill. Thorn added logs to the stove, stoking it until the iron ticked with heat, while May divested herself of the heavy, snow-caked layers. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably now, the reaction setting in. Thorn watched her struggle with the buttons of the rough wool coat, her fingers stiff and clumsy. Without a word, he crossed the space between them. He brushed her hands aside gently and began to undo the buttons himself. His large hands, usually so suited to gripping reins and hammers, moved with a surprising, deliberate tenderness. He slipped the coat from her shoulders, then the heavy flannel shirt, until she stood in the red cheongsam, the silk stained with water at the hem but still vibrant. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark, searching his face. The distance that had defined their arrangement, the contract, the business deal, felt suddenly thin, dissolved by the shared danger and the shared survival. "You are cold," Thorn murmured, his voice a rumble in his chest. He took her hands, rubbing them between his own calloused palms to bring the blood back. May did not pull away. She stepped closer, closing the gap, resting her forehead against his chest. It was a gesture of absolute trust, a surrender of the guard she kept up so diligently. Thorne stood frozen for a moment, his heart hammering against his ribs, before his arms came around her, pulling her into the warmth of his body. They stood there for a long time in the firelight, the storm raging outside, two solitary pillars leaning into one another to form an arch that could bear the weight of the world. Spring arrived not with a fanfare, but with the slow, muddy retreat of the snow. The earth re-emerged, brown and wet, smelling of potential. With the thaw came the inevitability of the debt. Holloway, the banker, arrived in a buggy that splashed thick mud onto the porch, flanked by two men who looked more like hired muscle than clerks. Thorne watched them from the porch, his shoulder leaning against the timber post, his face a mask of stone. May stood beside him. She had traded the heavy wool for a lighter work dress she had fashioned, but she had pinned her hair up with a comb that matched the red of her silk. Holloway climbed the steps, looking at the ranch with a proprietary sneer, his eyes sliding over May with dismissive amusement. "Well, Thorne," the banker said, slapping a leather folder against his palm, "the hardship period is up. I trust you're ready to vacate. I have a buyer interested in the timber rights." He didn't even ask for the money. He assumed failure. Thorne didn't move. He simply looked at the man. "The debt is paid," Thorne said, his voice flat. He reached into his vest and produced a heavy canvas sack, dropping it onto the porch railing. It landed with the heavy, dull clink of gold coinage and silver certificates, the proceeds from the cattle drive they had completed together just days prior, a drive May had ridden on, forcing the herd through the melt-swollen creeks. Holloway blinked, his composure cracking. "Impossible! And the household clause? This arrangement," he gestured vaguely at May. "Surely you don't expect the board to accept a laundry girl as a legitimate—" Thorne pushed off the post. The movement was small, but the violence inherent in it made the hired men step back. "Careful," Thorne said. The word hung in the air like a blade. "You are speaking of the owner of this ranch." He looked at May, his eyes softening just enough for her to see. "My wife. And my partner." May stepped forward, her gaze leveling with the banker's. "The receipt, Mr. Holloway," she said, extending her hand. "Write it now. We have work to do." The sun was high and bright over the valley, turning the new grass into a sea of emerald. Thorne stood by the fence line, looking out over the herd that was grazing contentedly. The fear of the winter, the crushing weight of the debt, the loneliness that had been his only companion for years, it was all gone, replaced by a steady, quiet peace. He heard the door of the cabin open and close, and the soft tread of boots on the earth. May came to stand beside him. She was wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She didn't look at him. She looked out at the land, at the mountains that had once been a prison of ice and were now a fortress of their home. "The roof needs tar before the rains," she said, her mind always on the practical, on the preservation of what they had built. Thorne chuckled, a low, rusty sound that he was learning to use more often. "I'll do it tomorrow," he said. He turned to face her, looking at the woman who had answered his desperate proposal not with submission, but with a demand for equity. That demand had saved him. It had forced him to see her not as a tool for a loophole, but as an equal, a force of nature that matched his own. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the rough skin of her palm, a map of the work they had shared. "May," he said. She looked up. "We did good." It was the most romantic speech he could muster, but in the language they had built, it meant everything. She squeezed his hand, a rare smile breaking the stoicism of her face, radiant and true. "Yes, husband," she replied softly. "We did." And as the wind blew through the grass, it no longer sounded like a threat, but like a promise of seasons to come, weathered together.